Since at least the 1980s, Japanese car manufacturers have been on a roll when it comes to making some of not only the most reliable, efficient, and affordable cars in the market, but also some of the coolest. I mean, an AE86 Toyota Corolla might not be a Ferrari by any stretch of the imagination. But was a Ferrari ever used in popular media as a drifting tofu delivery vehicle? I don't think so. In all seriousness though, since the Japanese car industry found its footing after the Second World War, it has truly developed into something cool, unique, but also incredibly successful. The best-selling car brand in the world being Japanese tells you all you need to know about how passionate the people of Japan are about their automobiles. But while cars are mostly meant to just take you from point A to point B as conveniently as possible, especially those made in Japan, the urge to push them to their limits and see how fast they can go is deeply ingrained in people all over the world. And Japan is certainly no exception there either. From Formula 1 to WRC, Japan has a long-standing presence in the world of professional motorsports. But arguably the country's most significant influence on automotive culture may lie outside the sanctioned circuits, because in many ways, Japan's rich history of illegal street racing has played a pivotal role in shaping the global automotive landscape. Whether it be the winding roads of Japan's many mountains, among the bright lights and bustling streets of the big cities, or the seemingly endless amounts of asphalt found on the country's highways, underground racing in Japan is as cool as it is dangerous, and just flat out stupid. And it is this combination of automotive history, speed, style, adrenaline, and sheer stupidity that, if you ask me, is worth a closer look. So how about we hit the road and embark on a journey through the fascinating world of Japanese car culture, exploring how Japan fell in love with cars in the first place, how they started driving them really fast professionally, how they started driving them really fast illegally, and what types of unique styles, techniques, and communities emerged from it. If you end up enjoying this ride, then feel free to hit the brakes at some point and leave a like and subscribe for more content about everything shady and or historically significant about Japan. And for as little as $1 per month, that Patreon page down there should be a pretty good way of supporting me even further, should you wish to do so. But for now, time to step back on the gas. This is illegal street racing in Japan, a story of drift kings and midnight clubs. So, Japan is nowadays absolutely inseparable not only from the street racing scene, but from the car industry as a whole. But before they could build their own vehicles, let alone race them, well, they had to start somewhere. And actually, they weren't as late to the party as you might think. It was in 1898, just over a decade after German engineer Carl Benz introduced the world to the first car ever made, that the first automobile arrived in the island nation of Japan. The first attempts to make a Japanese-produced car followed in 1904 and 1905, with these two, let's say, interesting-looking vehicles. I mean, hey, you gotta start somewhere, right? The next big milestone came in 1917, when the Japanese giant Mitsubishi introduced the country to its first serious production automobile. Manufacturers like Isuzu followed suit in the 1920s, while the 1930s was when multiple now iconic brands first started dabbling in car production. Toyota, Suzuki, Nissan. The Japanese really started to understand what it took to make a car at that point. But you don't want to just make cars. You want to drive them too, and at high speeds if possible. And well, that's what the Japanese did, as early as the 1920s actually. But with the car industry still in its infancy at that point, there wasn't really any dedicated place to drive them fast. And so, Japan's first speed demons were forced to take their rides to places like horse racing tracks, abandoned airfields, and if they had to the streets. In that sense, I guess it could be said that street racing in Japan, at least in a very primitive form, is almost as old as the Japanese car itself. Quite obviously though, this would not suffice in the long run. What the Japanese needed was a place where they could truly take their cars to the limit. And that is exactly what they finally got in 1936, when Tamagawa Speedway opened its doors to racers and spectators alike. It was also during the first race ever held on Tamagawa Speedway that a 29-year-old Honda Soichiro, competing in a modified Ford called the Hamamatsu, crashed, sustaining injuries that ended his racing career. But just leaving the car industry altogether wasn't an option for the young Honda Soichiro. And so instead of driving Japan's fastest cars, he made it his mission to build them. And in 1946, he founded the Honda Motor Company, which went on to produce some of the country's most iconic vehicles on both 2 and 4 wheels. The legendary Suzuka Circuit, host of the Formula 1 Grand Prix of Japan since 1963, was originally built as a Honda test track at the request of Honda Soichiro as well. A true legend, this guy. At that point, one thing was clear. The Japanese had a deep-rooted love for all kinds of motorsports going into the 1960s. An obsession with speed and power that would only grow as time went on. But the thing is, while places like Suzuka Circuit ushered in a new and exciting era for Japanese motorsports, racetracks in Japan were still few and far between, while the country's fast-growing population developed an increasing amount of fascination with the sport, which in turn also fueled, pun absolutely intended, an increasing desire for personal high-speed, high-adrenaline experiences. But booking a day on the track wasn't really a thing back then, I guess, and even if it was, though things were certainly starting to improve in Japan by the early 1960s, this was still just a bit over a decade after the devastation and destruction of World War II, and generally speaking, people were pretty damn broke. But thankfully, this was also the decade where a couple of different factors slowly started coming together to form an environment where street racing in Japan was allowed to flourish alongside the growing fascination with professional motorsports for the first time. For one, after a couple of somewhat difficult decades following the Second World War, Japanese car manufacturers finally started gaining some traction during the mid-1960s. The introduction of affordable, reliable cars like the Toyota Corolla coincided with the recovery and fast growth of the whole Japanese economy, which in turn gave people disposable income to spend on luxury items. A car was oftentimes the first big investment that people chose to make. The Japanese car market was booming by the early 70s. The cars themselves got better and better, and a much improved road infrastructure across the country made sure that there were countless places to be discovered and endless amounts of asphalt to be conquered in your shiny new car. The stage was set for the Japanese equivalent of the average Joe to really start tearing up some rubber, and these guys quickly found some very interesting spots to do so as well. In search of spots that could serve as their own little racetracks away from professional circuits, Japan's first couple of street racers started taking their rides to secluded places like forest roads. Especially at night, regular traffic was incredibly low here, and fast driving was possible without being interrupted by either slow drivers or the police. These secluded places were actually so good for fast driving that eventually, actual professional drivers started joining regular street racers at these spots. And the reason was simple. They too had to practice somewhere, and with racetracks being available neither everywhere nor around the clock, the favorite spots of the street racers oftentimes ended up becoming the favorite spots of the professional racers as well. As more and more racers started gathering on Japan's secluded roads at night, the country's general public did what they do best. They coined a term to describe them, and so the country's growing collection of street racers eventually became known as hashiriya, or literally those who run. And run they certainly did, and not only on the aforementioned forest roads. One certain type of spot became so popular that it ended up developing its very own, unique community of passionate street racers starting in the 1970s. the mountains, and more specifically, mountain passes, or Touge. There are several different reasons why the mountain pass became the preferred location for street racers across Japan. First of all, finding one is really damn easy, because as you may know already, Japan is kinda mountainous. And by that I mean it is very mountainous, with close to 13,000 named mountains sprinkled across its numerous islands. But not only are mountains, and with them mountain passes, incredibly easy to find in Japan, their roads are basically ready-made racetracks in more ways than just one as well. Mountainsides tend to be pretty damn steep, and so roads are designed to curve and wind their way up and over them, allowing heavy vehicles like trucks to scale them without a problem. But what this also does is provide a challenging, unforgiving course for those who are trying to descend the Touge as quickly as possible. It is a fast, dangerous, and thrilling way of putting both your car and your skills as a driver to the test. And as more and more young Japanese car enthusiasts discovered the thrills of the mountain roads, Touge racing took on a life and identity of its own. And so it was only natural that eventually people would start competing against each other to push each other to the limit and see who's the best. Some competed for the best possible times down the Touge. Others partook in 1v1 competitions, usually cat and mouse style races with one driver in the back trying to keep up with, or perhaps even overtake, the other driver in front of him, all while navigating the tight twists and turns of the Touge at the highest possible speed. Thrilling stuff, and obviously pretty dangerous. Crashing your car at some point was more or less inevitable. But some unspoken rules like uphill vehicles have priority were meant to at least ensure the safety of other racers and the occasional non-racer trying to make their way over the mountain pass in one piece. Over time, some particular mountain passes gained a reputation for being more challenging and more exciting than all the others, establishing themselves as the most legendary Touge in the country. If you lived in areas like Gunma Prefecture or near the iconic Hakone Turnpike of Kanagawa Prefecture, you had no choice but get used to hearing the roar of engines basically every night. Because it was then, with traffic having died down, that the mountain passes fully belonged to the Touge racers and their cars. But after a while, roaring engines wouldn't be the only sound preventing you from getting a healthy 8 hours of sleep per night. Because it didn't take long for screeching tires to join the sweet sounds of the Touge orchestra, when a new sort of driving technique took the Japanese street racing scene by storm. Drifting. Now, saying that drifting was a new sort of driving technique might not be 100% correct. It might have been new to the Japanese street racers of the 1970s, but obviously the act of sliding your car around a corner, whether it was done intentionally or not, must be as old as the automobile itself. At some point though, drivers discovered that this could be used for cornering more efficiently, and more importantly for looking way cooler while doing so. But contrary to popular belief, the first man to truly embrace this technique probably did not come from Japan. Because all the way back in the 1930s, when Japan was still just making its first few steps as a motorsports nation, Italian race car driver Tazio Giorgio Nuvolari, what a beautiful name, he used the technique of putting his car sideways into corners in competition. And apparently, dude was good enough at it to be credited by none other than Enzo Ferrari with inventing the four-wheel drift. But here's the thing. The first person who truly specialized in the four-wheel drift, making it part of his signature racing style and introducing the technique to a nationwide and eventually even a global audience, was Japanese. And this guy was so well known for driving sideways that he eventually became known as the DK.
You know what DK stands for?
Donkey Kong?
Drift King.
Believe it or not, Drift King wasn't the man's birth name. The king of sideways driving was born under the only slightly less cool-sounding name Tsuchiya Keiichi in a small city called Tomi, part of Nagano Prefecture. This area was home to some pretty dope mountain passes to do some racing on, like the now legendary Usui Pass, and like many other Japanese in the early 70s, Tsuchiya witnessed the meteoric rise of the Touge racing scene all around him. The moment that ultimately set Tsuchiya on his path to drifting royalty, however, came when he went to spectate an actual professional race. You know, on one of those racetrack thingies. And it was a driver called Takahashi Kunimitsu that managed to catch the young Tsuchiya's attention like no other competitor on a track that day. Takahashi Kunimitsu, also known as simply Kuni-san, actually started his career as a professional motorcycle driver in the early 60s. And a damn good one at that, celebrating one success after another and becoming the first Japanese to win a World Grand Prix title. But after a horrific incident during the incredibly dangerous Isle of Man TT race in 1962 that nearly killed him, it looked like his racing career had come to an end. But Kuni-san soon discovered that he was just as talented on 4 wheels as he was on 2. He teamed up with Nissan starting in the mid-60s and started dominating the touring car scene in no time. All with the help of his iconic Hakosuka Skyline 2000 GTR, which he tended to 4-wheel drift into as many corners as humanly possible. A young Tsuchiya Keiichi saw this and was awe-inspired. He went and purchased his very own Nissan Skyline 2000 GT GC10, took it to the mountains surrounding his hometown, and practiced his drifting during every free minute that he had. Turns out that the twists and turns of the Touge were the perfect environment to practice his drifting, and eventually, Tsuchiya became so good that he started developing his very own drifting techniques, some of which are still used to this day. In that sense, while Tsuchiya wasn't the one who discovered drifting or anything, he was the one who refined it to a point that no one else did before him. And even after becoming a professional driver in 1977, he managed to juggle both professional racing and illegal street racing at the same time. For the next 10 years following his professional racing debut, he would conquer the racetracks by day and dominate the Touge by night. Until in 1987, he was blessed with what was perhaps the most defining moment of his entire career. In collaboration with a few Japanese car magazines, Tsuchiya produced a 3-part series of VHS tapes that were so successful in Japan that they eventually saw an international release as well. Known in the West as Plus P, this series of videotapes showcased Tsuchiya's insane driving and drifting techniques that he had been working on for more than a decade, performed in what else but the now ultra-famous and ultra-desirable AE86 Corolla, aka Hachiroku, a car which is now considered to be the drift car. These tapes did way more than just make one guy famous though. They brought drifting to a much wider audience than ever before, both in and outside of Japan, because for a whole generation of car fanatics worldwide, this was the first time that they had ever seen drifting performed on this level, on a regular road no less. Now everyone wanted to mess up their tires trying to be like Tsuchiya Keiichi, the newly crowned Drift King. Tsuchiya's tapes undoubtedly played a huge role in the surge of popularity that drifting experienced in Japan starting in the late 80s, but actually as early as 1986. A year before the release of the Plus B tapes, Japanese car magazines like Carboy and Option started organizing events that gave drifters across the nation a chance to put their skills to the test in actual, professional events that, much like the drifting community itself, grew and grew over the following years and decades.
Well, if you drove like that on the public roads, you deserve to be called a maniac.
Events like the D1 Grand Prix, first held in 2001 and still going strong, show that drifting has proven itself to be more than just a fad of the late 80s and early 90s, but a legitimate sport that requires an insane amount of practice and skill. As for Tsuchiya Keiichi, the guy fully embraced his title of Drift King and stays involved in the drifting community even today. Not only that, but he helped introduce more than just one generation of young people to the fascinating world of driving sideways by aiding the creation of some of drifting's most popular depictions in entertainment media. The incredible Initial D manga and anime TV series were not only loosely based on the life of Tsuchiya Keiichi, he also worked as an advisor during its creation. Those who are not into manga or anime might perhaps be more familiar with 2006's The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift. This goddamn movie, I swear. Probably my personal all-time favorite guilty pleasure type of movie. It's not awful by any means, but taking it seriously is also pretty hard if you ask me. I mean, are you trying to tell me that all I gotta do to get sent to Japan as punishment is run around with a gigantic forehead and almost kill Brad from Home Improvement during a race? Well, sign me up. In all seriousness though, the drifting and Touge style racing scenes in this movie, super cool, and the overall stunt choreography is pretty damn amazing at times as well. And why wouldn't it be, when none other than the Drift King himself not only worked on the movie as a consultant and stunt coordinator, but also made an actual appearance in the movie as well. That charming old fisher dude at the docks, that's Tsuchiya in the flesh. I think for now, that's enough talk about Touge and drifting, because while those two scenes are perhaps the most well-known part of Japanese underground racing, they only form a part of what is a much larger collection of street racing communities that, depending on the type of environment available to them, started to pursue their own goals and dreams behind the steering wheel. The police especially likes to refer to the different types of illegal street racing that were created as a result as zoku, or tribes. Drifters and Touge racers, for example, are referred to as Drift-zoku and Touge-zoku respectively. Makes sense. But beyond that, you also have groups like the so-called Zero-zoku, basically drag racers looking to achieve the fastest time driving in a roughly 400 meter long straight line. Hence the name Zero-yon or Zero-4-zoku. For the most part, all of these street racing tribes were, at least in most cases, pretty easy to avoid, since they like to keep their fast driving away from the public eye as much as possible by hiding on secluded mountain passes, the docks, or in empty industrial areas. And then there were those who were perhaps a bit harder to avoid. Just like Japan's mountain passes, its extensive highway network first saw the emergence of speed limit ignoring rebels on four wheels back in the early 70s. And just like with the Touge, some spots eventually became more popular than others. Many of Japan's fastest street racers found a comfy home on the roads of Tokyo's Shuto Expressway, its looping sections especially providing an endless stream of adrenaline for dozens and eventually hundreds of illegal thrill seekers in and around the capital of Japan. By the 80s and 90s, the Roulette-zoku, as they were called, were not a rare sight on highways all over the country. Active mostly late at night or during early morning hours, when traffic consisted almost exclusively of the occasional truck here and there. Those looking for like-minded racers to hang out or compete with on the Shuto Expressway like to gather at parking areas like Daikoku, Hakozaki, Shibaura, Tatsumi, and many others. And as long as you were interested in driving too fast, you were welcome. And when I say too fast, I mean way too fast. To give you a bit of an idea of how fast these guys were going, the outer loop of the Shuto Expressway, a particularly popular racetrack among street racers, takes around 18 minutes to complete at regular, legal speeds. Some of the top street racers on the expressway, however, occasionally manage to complete the outer loop in under 5 minutes. Absolutely insane. Insane lap times like these of course became more and more common throughout the 90s and then the 2000s, when Japanese cars had become so fast, their engines so easy to tune and resistant to all kinds of abuse that reaching speeds of well over 250 km per hour could be achieved with little to no effort. Technology eventually came in handy not only in achieving record times on Japan's most popular expressways, but also in sharing them with a community. records oftentimes found their way onto anonymous message boards like Touge starting in the early 2000s. Obviously, the internet also made connecting with other street racers and groups of street racers much easier than ever before. But the existence of actual street racing groups long predates dial-up modems and message boards. Because whether you were a Touge racer, a fan of the four-wheel drift, or a Seroyon drag racing enthusiast, teaming up with others was a natural progression of dedicating yourself to illegal street racing. And the most well-known group, and to many people the face of street racing in Japan, was undoubtedly the mysterious Midnight Club. Somehow, some way, this group of Japanese street racers found itself featured in Western car magazines and TV programs, from the UK especially, as early as the mid-1990s. And speaking of UK television programs, these guys never actually called themselves the Midnight Club. Their actual name is either Midnight with a space in between, or Midnight Racing Team. It was the famous UK car enthusiast and television host Jeremy Clarkson who is thought to have started the whole Midnight Club thing during this 1995 episode of his show Motor World.
It's too expensive for the drifters. It's within easy reach, though, of the boys in the Midnight Club.
It does sound a whole lot cooler, I'll give him that. But ripping on the design of the frickin' R32 Skyline while rocking that hairdo?
You would have thought if you were designing a car to take on the Porsche 928 and the Ferrari 355, you'd make it look just a little bit more exciting than this. But maybe they can't. Maybe they don't know how to. Maybe they have the same problem with their cars as they do with their buildings.
I don't know about that, Chief. It was these types of television programs and the many articles about Midnight featured in magazines like the UK's Max Power magazine, the Danish Autoviz, and the American Turbo magazine that gave thousands of car enthusiasts of all ages and nationalities their first glimpse into Japan's fascinating underground street racing culture. Seeing photos and the occasional bits of video footage of this mysterious sounding Midnight Club must have been pretty damn wild, I would imagine. And honestly, the fascination around Midnight never really died down. And with the group being so well known and yet shrouded in so much mystery at the same time, people tend to be fascinated with every bit of information about them that occasionally pops up. One of the earliest details about Midnight that quickly made the rounds were the rumors about just how difficult it was to join their ranks in the first place. Founded in 1982, the original purpose of Midnight was a rather simple one. Gather a group of elite street racers, the best that they could find. However, simply being a skilled driver and having a fast car wouldn't suffice. What the founding members of Midnight valued above all was personality. These guys were planning to assemble a team that would spend basically its entire free time driving together. So obviously your personality would be just as important as your skills behind the steering wheel. In addition to that, the goal of Midnight was to be as low-key and secretive about its existence as possible. Not because they were shy or anything, they were just incredibly protective of their biggest hobby, which just so happened to involve breaking the law on a regular basis. Allowing the wrong people to join the group would put their biggest hobby at risk, and so making sure that members were ready to put in the work to be a part of their thing was a pretty efficient way of avoiding members who weren't trustworthy or dedicated enough. To even get a chance to join Midnight, you would need to know someone, or know someone who knew someone. And once that was taken care of, you would attend their meetings on a regular basis, in some cases for years before ever being accepted as a part of the team. Allegedly, potential members at their first meeting had to stand in front of the whole group and introduce and talk about themselves. That's the point where I would have failed miserably. You know how sometimes they make you do these breaking the ice types of activities when you're new in school or at a job? Now imagine doing that in front of a group of super dedicated illegal street racers. The thought alone makes me cringe. Now once you got past all that and actually became a member, You would get to join in on Midnight's legendary drives, which, as you may have already guessed by their name, tended to start sometime around midnight. The exact routes and meetup locations changed all the time, but during its early years, Midnight was known to frequent the Tomei Expressway between Nagoya and Tokyo. To be more specific, there was a roughly 30-kilometer long stretch between the Ebina service area in Kanagawa and the toll booth at Seta City in Tokyo that proved to be especially popular among many street racers from the 1970s onward. But by the 1990s, Midnight had transitioned to racing mostly, though not exclusively, on the Wangan-sen, or Bayshore route, a 62-kilometer long section of Tokyo's Shuto Expressway connecting Yokohama's Kanazawa ward with Ichikawa, Chiba Prefecture. On the Wangan-sen, with a speed limit of around 80 kilometers per hour, members of Midnight were famous for frequently hitting speeds upwards of 300 kilometers per hour. And in a variety of cars too. There were Nissan Skylines, Toyota Supras. Some specific Midnight cars were so fast, they became legends of the Japanese underground racing scene, like this famously undefeated Mazda RX-7, and of course the iconic Yoshida Specials Porsche 930 Turbo, belonging to none other than the chairman of Midnight back in the 90s. As you can see, despite how secretive and low-key Midnight always tried to be, there's quite a bit of cool information to be found about them if you're ready to do some digging. Because let me tell you, researching these guys wasn't easy. Their secretive nature combined with their international fame carries some negative side effects as well. Because there seems to be a lot of misinformation about Midnight that presents itself upon a quick Google search. Surely the biggest and most widespread misconception about Midnight must be the story of a fateful crash in 1999 between some of the racing team's members and a group of Kanjō-zoku bikers that led Midnight to just straight up disband immediately. But Midnight never disbanded, and from what I was able to gather, a crash like that never took place either. Now, the team was unfortunately involved in some accidents. Even Midnight's most loyal members would probably admit that much. But one of the many reasons why they are still around today, more than 40 years after first hitting the road together, is the fact that since the team's inception in 1982, Midnight Racing Team has stuck to a set of strict moral and ethical codes that was supposed to go hand in hand with their high level of secrecy in guaranteeing both the public's safety and the crew's longevity. Actual head-to-head races were almost exclusively done against fellow members, and direct competition with other street racing crews was very rare. And generally, street racing groups prefer to stay out of each other's way in order to avoid trouble and attention. No street racing beef or turf wars seem to ever have taken place between Midnight and the many other crews in or outside of Tokyo. And speaking of outside of Tokyo, a unique subcategory of highway racers eventually formed in Japan's Kansai region. Here, what the rest of Japan usually refers to as Roulette-zoku became known as Kanjō-zoku, or circular tribes. A name that, again, was inspired by the racers' tendency to drive along looping highways. The Kanjō-zoku's favorite spots to break the speed limit are certain sections of the Hanshin Expressway that connects Osaka, Kobe, and Kyoto. And unlike the late-night highways in and around the capital, where a wide variety of cars can be seen doing their thing, the Kanjō-zoku actually have one specific car model that they prefer over any other. The Honda Civic, a compact and affordable hatchback that could be tuned and abused to an insane level. The Civic sold and still sells really well, and perhaps at least when it comes to the Japanese street racing and tuning scene, the Kanjō-zoku played an important role in popularizing this now iconic car during its early years. As for the current Japanese underground racing scene as a whole, I think it's very interesting that by the early to mid-2000s, you know, when all the import tuning, Fast and the Furious, bright neon light stuff took the world by storm, the scene in Japan itself was already beginning a sharp decline. The same traffic laws and regulations that were partly responsible for ushering in the decline of other groups like the Bosozoku biker gangs also really hurt the illegal street racing scene. And as cool as many aspects of street racing are, it's hard to argue against such regulations. As the community around street racing became bigger and bigger, horrific scenes like this one, injuries, and sometimes even death caused by reckless driving unfortunately became all too common. But the scene didn't exclusively decline over the past 2 decades either. Because occasionally, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the streets were emptier than ever before, street racing in Japan experienced some small resurgences. Overall, street racing is a double-edged sword. Or in this case, a double-edged katana, I guess. From breakneck speeds to the four-wheel drift, it's hard not to somewhat sympathize with and admire the street racers' desire to test their skills and their car's power out on the open road. But perhaps a compromise should be found, one that ensures the safety of regular drivers while also giving enthusiasts a chance to get their shot of adrenaline. Midnight Racing Club, for example, now under new leadership, is said to have shifted its focus off the streets and more, though not entirely, onto actual racetracks. And honestly, drifting became bigger than ever before after embracing the racetrack. So who's to say that the same thing couldn't help ensure the future of street racing teams like Midnight as well? And that's it for today's video. Are there any other aspects of street racing in Japan that I failed to mention? Let us know in the comments down below. Are you among my loyal Patreon supporters? Well, a big fat shout out goes out to all of you, including Bobby Wu, Javier Sodavia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats and Soup, and Charred B-Man. And to everyone else who is still here, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.